4 months earlier, the word I kept hearing was before. Before the ground freezes solid. Before the snow makes the roads impassable for a moving truck. Before you get in over your head, the loan officer said, before you understand what 38 acres actually costs a person your age. The lawyer's letter came on a Tuesday, the 14th of December, 2021, 3 days after my grandfather's heart gave out in the milk house he hadn't used for milk in over 40 years. I remember the date because it was also the day the temperature dropped to 11 degrees and stayed there, and I stood in the county clerk's office in a coat that wasn't warm enough, holding a stapled packet that made me the owner of land I'd only ever visited on Sundays. 38 acres. A farmhouse, with a roof that had been patched more times than painted. A dairy barn whose east wall had folded in on itself sometime around 2015, nobody had bothered to say exactly when. And a debt, $14,200, owed to the Larson County Farmers Cooperative Bank, a number that had apparently been accumulating against the property since before I was old enough to understand what a mortgage was. Roy Kessler called it a note. He said the word carefully, like it was a kindness to me, sitting behind his desk with a photograph of his own farm. Sold, someone told me later, back in the 90s, turned just slightly toward his side of the room. 90 days, he said. That's what the estate settlement allows before we have to talk about next steps. He didn't say foreclosure. He didn't have to. The neighboring farmer, a man who'd known my grandfather since Eisenhower was president, drove over the same week with a casserole his wife had made and an offer that came out of him easy as breathing. He'd take the acreage off my hands, save me the trouble, give me a fair price before the ground thawed, and I found out what real work looked like. He meant it kindly. That was the worst part. Nobody in Larson County was cruel to me that December. They were just certain. I didn't argue with any of them. I didn't have the numbers to argue with. What I had was a key ring with 11 keys on it, none labeled, and a farmhouse so cold at night that I slept in 2 flannel shirts that used to be my grandmother's, and a barn I hadn't stepped foot inside since I was maybe 9 years old, when a board had given way under my sneaker and my grandfather had pulled me out by the collar and told me, not unkindly, that some buildings keep their own secrets and don't owe children an explanation. I had 90 days. I didn't yet know what was locked behind that barn, in a cellar I'd forgotten even existed until the 4th week, when the snow finally melted enough off the north side to show me a door I hadn't known was there. The farmhouse kitchen kept its own kind of cold, a cold that lived in the linoleum and the countertops and didn't care what the thermostat said. I ran the propane heater from the hardware store in Larson, the one with the dented reflector panel, 6 feet from the table, and still my coffee grew a skin of ice if I let it sit 10 minutes. 89 days. 88. I made a mark on the calendar nailed above the sink. The one from the co-op with a different tractor on it every month, red ballpoint, 1 line at a time, the way I imagined a person in a cell might do it, though nobody was keeping me there except the numbers and the not knowing. I went through the house room by room with a legal pad, writing down what was worth anything and what wasn't. A formica table, chipped at one corner, a cedar chest full of quilts that smelled like mothballs and someone else's decades, $61 in a coffee can labeled buttons, though there were no buttons in it. I found his reading glasses on the nightstand, folded shut, like he meant to come back for them. The barn was worse and better than I remembered. Worse because the north wall had given up somewhere in the last 10 years, a slow collapse rather than a sudden one, boards sagging inward like a mouth losing its teeth. Snow drifted through the gap in a fan across the old milking stalls. Better because nothing had burned, nothing had washed away, the roof over the south half still held. I stood in the doorway with a flashlight from the glove box of my grandfather's truck and didn't go further than 10 feet for a long time. The building smelled like frozen dust and old manure, and something underneath that, sweeter, almost yeasty, that I couldn't place and didn't try very hard to. It was the 4th week, a Tuesday, when the snow finally pulled back off the north foundation like a sheet dragged off furniture, and I saw the door. Low, set into the fieldstone below grade, the kind of door you'd miss your whole childhood if nobody ever pointed at it. A canning cellar, I figured, the way half the old farms in the county had one, shelves of tomatoes and beans put up by women whose names were on the headstones out past the tree line. I brushed the frost off the hasp and found a padlock, rusted nearly solid, the kind of lock nobody buys anymore, brass gone the color of a old penny. No key on my ring fit it. I tried all 11, kneeling in the wet snow with my knuckles going numb, and none of them so much as turned in the mechanism. I sat back on my heels and looked at that door a long while. 85 days left by my count, though I'd have to check the calendar to be sure. Whatever my grandfather had locked away down there, he hadn't wanted it found by accident. I left the door for the afternoon and went looking for a key instead of a way to force it, because forcing things had never gotten me anywhere with this place except a skinned knuckle and a longer list of what was broken. The workshop sat off the west end of the barn, a lean-to room with a wood stove gone cold since before I was born, and a workbench still laid out like someone meant to come back to it. Coffee cans of screws sorted by length. A calendar from 1974 nailed to the wall, the kind feed stores used to give away, curled brown at the corners. I went through the drawers one at a time, patient the way you have to be with a stuck drawer that's swollen shut with 40 winters of damp, and in the third one down, under a spool of baling wire and a broken pair of pliers, I found a notebook bound in leather gone stiff and gray, the kind of leather that used to be black. I sat down on the stool because my legs told me to, before my head caught up. The handwriting was small and even. A farmer's hand, no wasted loops. Columns ruled in pencil, dates running down the left margin starting in April of 1974. Beside them, notes in a shorthand I had to read 3 times before it made sense. Inoculated, rye, pin set, second chamber, oyster, second flush, sold Whitcomb's, $11.40. Page after page of it, spring into summer, the numbers small but steady, $40 one week, $60 the next. Always Whitcomb's, always the same tight hand recording it like a man keeping score with himself. I knew Whitcomb's. Everybody in the county knew Whitcomb's, the grocery on Main with the green awning that had been there since my mother was a girl, still run by a Whitcomb, though which generation I couldn't have told you. Nobody in that store had ever once mentioned buying mushrooms off my grandfather. Nobody in town had. I'd have remembered. The kind of detail that gets repeated at the diner counter for 30 years. A novelty, a curiosity, and instead, there was nothing, not a whisper, like the whole operation had been erased on purpose, or just forgotten, the way most things get forgotten, in a place where the weather gives you plenty else to talk about. The entries ran 11 weeks and then stopped mid-page. No explanation. The last line just a date and a dash, where the numbers should have gone. October 9th, 1974. And after that, nothing but blank ruled lines all the way to the back cover, waiting on notes that were never going to come. I sat with the notebook open on my knee, and the cold coming up through the concrete floor into my boots, and I understood, without being able to explain how I understood it, that the padlocked door and this book were the same locked thing, and that whatever he'd shut away down there wasn't preserves. I drove the mile down to the Halverson place the next morning, 71 degrees of frost on the windshield and the heater in the truck barely keeping up, because I didn't know who else to ask. He was out at the mailbox in a canvas coat older than I was, and when I pulled up he looked at me the way people in Larson County look at anything unexpected, like it might be trouble, like it might not be worth the trouble of finding out. I asked him if he remembered my grandfather growing mushrooms. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there with his hand still on the mailbox flag, and something moved through his face that wasn't surprise. It was closer to the look of a man watching a door open onto a room he'd shut himself. "Come in out of the cold," he said. "I'll put coffee on." His kitchen smelled like wood smoke and burnt percolator, and he sat me down at a table with a checked oilcloth worn through at the corners, and he told me, slow, the way old men tell things they've decided not to think about for a long time. My grandfather had gotten the idea from a magazine, he said, some university extension bulletin, about growing oyster mushrooms on hardwood sawdust logs. Cheap, fast, no land needed beyond a dark room and patience. He'd built racks in the dairy barn loft, back before the loft was full of hay, and for a summer and part of a fall, he'd hauled in sawdust from the mill and inoculated logs and sold what came up to the Whitcomb girl's father, cash, no paperwork, quiet money. Then the herd needed the space, he said. Milk prices that year, he told me he couldn't afford to be growing something nobody around here would pay real money for when he had cows standing in the yard eating his hay, so he tore the racks out, boarded up the room. I don't think he ever said another word about it. He looked down at his coffee a long moment. I should have helped him, he said. I had sawdust of my own going to waste. I had 2 good hands. I told myself it wasn't my business. A man's crops are his own business. And I let him fold it up alone in that barn without so much as asking him not to. He didn't say it like a confession looking for forgiveness. He said it like a fact he'd been carrying so long it had worn smooth, the way a stone wears smooth in a creek, no sharp edges left to cut anyone with, just weight. I sat there with my hands around the coffee cup and thought about the dash where a number should have been, October 9th, and how a whole life's worth of turning away could hide behind 11 weeks of careful handwriting in a leather notebook nobody was ever supposed to open again. You still got that sawdust, I said, or know where to get it. He looked up at me, and for the first time that morning, something in his face wasn't sorry. Petrix, he said, still runs the mill same as ever. Same waste pile, only bigger now, the way everything gets bigger, and nobody stops to ask if it should. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. I drove home that afternoon with 71 days left on the note, according to the calendar I'd taped inside the kitchen cabinet, where nobody but me would see it. A black X through every morning, like a woman marking time in a cell, and I went straight past the house to the barn. The padlock on the cellar door had rusted to the color of dried blood. I'd walked past it 100 times as a kid, told not to go down there, told it was where the well pump used to flood, and nothing worth having was in it. My grandfather had never once corrected that story. I found the bolt cutters in the workshop, the same drawer as the notebook, and it took me longer than I want to admit to get the angle right, my hands shaking some from the cold and some from something else. The door came open on a breath of air that smelled like a forest floor in October, damp and dark and alive in a way the rest of the barn wasn't. Mason jars lined 3 shelves, dozens of them, some cloudy with dried-out mycelium gone the color of old bone, hand-labeled in his blocky pencil print, strain A, white oyster, 574, and others packed with what looked like sawdust and grain, gone hard as stone, sealed with wax around the lids. Spawn, though I didn't know the word for it yet. Cultures he'd built and never used, or used once and never used again. Taped to the inside of the door, at eye level, where a person had to be standing right in the cellar to see it, was an envelope gone soft and yellow at the corners. Written across the front, not to me, not to anyone with a name. To whoever isn't afraid of rot. I stood there a long time before I opened it. The cellar held the cold the way a well holds water, still and total, and I could hear my own breathing and nothing else. No wind through the barn boards, no truck on the county road. I thought about a dash where a number should have been. I thought about 11 weeks in a leather notebook. I thought about a man folding up a life's work quiet enough that even his neighbor of 40 years never heard him do it. Then I broke the tape and opened it, and the first line was in the same blocky pencil hand as the ledger, steadier than I expected, like he'd known exactly who would end up reading it, even if he never let himself believe it would be true. The letter ran 4 pages, front and back, and the handwriting stayed steady clear through to the last line, which told me something about him I hadn't known. That he wrote slow when it mattered, the way other men might pray. He said he started in the fall of 1974, after the milk price dropped and he'd already sold off half the herd to keep the rest fed through winter. He said a man from the extension office in Wausau had given a talk at the Grange Hall about specialty crops, and he'd sat in the back row not believing a word of it until the man mentioned mushrooms grown on logs, on sawdust, in the dark, needing nothing from the ground but shade and water. He said it sounded like something you could do with what you already had, which at the time was a dairy barn going quiet and a cellar built for jars nobody was filling anymore. He wrote down the method plain, like he was talking to someone standing next to him with a notebook of her own. Oak logs cut in the fall, drilled and plugged with spawn, laid in shade until the mycelium took. Sawdust beds where the logs were too much work, or too slow, hardwood sawdust, packed and pasteurized, kept at a humidity he described as wet enough to feel foolish about. He said the mistake most men made was rushing the dark stage, checking too often, letting cold air in when the beds needed to sit undisturbed. Patience, he wrote, was the only ingredient the extension man hadn't mentioned, and it turned out to be the expensive one. Then he told me why he'd stopped. The winter of '76 came in, hard and early, a cold snap that dropped temperatures below zero for the better part of 3 weeks, and his beds went dormant just as he needed them to flush. He said the bank back then, a different name, a different building, but the same blank patience, wouldn't extend the note on the strength of a crop that hadn't come up yet. He'd had 90 days of his own once, and when they ran out, he'd folded the whole operation into the cellar and locked the door, telling himself it was temporary, the way a man tells himself a lot of things right before they become permanent. I read it twice. Then I stood in the cold with the paper going soft again in my hands and did the arithmetic I didn't want to do. 60 days left on a clock, nobody outside that cellar knew was running, and a method 45 years old, sitting in my palm like it had been waiting the whole time for someone foolish enough, or desperate enough, to try it a second time. The number that mattered wasn't 60, it was 45. The span he'd written between inoculation and first flush, back when Whitcomb's was still buying crates of oysters for $4 a pound and calling twice a week to ask when the next batch would be ready. 45 days meant I'd be cutting it against the note itself, harvest landing sometime around the last week of January, 31, or maybe February 1st if the cold slowed it the way it had slowed him. There was no room in that math for a bad batch. There was no room for a second try. I called Roy Kessler on a Tuesday, the 21st of December, from the kitchen phone, with the cord stretched to the window so I could watch the barn while I talked. He said what I expected him to say. Sell the tractor, sell whatever stock was left, scrape together enough of a partial to show good faith, and he'd see what he could do about softening the 90 days into something longer. It was reasonable advice. It was the kind of advice that had already failed once in that cellar, 45 years before I was born. I told him I'd think about it. Then I hung up and did the opposite. $310 left in the account after the propane bill cleared. I know because I wrote it in the front of the leather notebook, under his old columns, in ink that didn't match. 90 of it went to plastic sheeting at the co-op in town, Sawmill, the kind meant for greenhouse walls. 60 went to a second-hand humidifier from a classifieds ad in Eau Claire, a woman selling it because her husband's grow tent hobby hadn't taken. The rest I kept for gas, because the truck needed to make 4 trips to Petrick Brothers before the sawdust pile in the barn was tall enough to work with. The mill let me back the truck right up to the burn pit, past a sign that said, "Disposal fee applies," in orange paint, and the man running the loader that day just waved me through without asking questions, like it happened all the time, like the sawdust wanted somewhere to go as much as I did. I hauled it home in the bed under a tarp, the snow starting fine and dry around 4 in the afternoon, and shoveled it into the barn in the dark with a headlamp strapped over a wool cap, breathing through my mouth because the cold made the sawdust smell sharper, cleaner, more like something alive than something thrown away. By the time I stopped, my hands wouldn't close all the way around the shovel handle. I stood in the doorway and looked at what I'd spent. Every dollar of it. All of it. Nothing held back for a partial payment. Nothing held back for anything, and understood there was no version of the next 45 days where I could undo tonight. The cold came in on a Tuesday, the kind of cold the radio called dangerous before it called it anything else. -19 overnight, and a wind that found every gap in the barn citing my grandfather had patched 30 years before I was born. I'd read enough of his notebook by then to know oyster spawn didn't care about ambition or debt schedules. It cared about 70 degrees and 85% humidity, numbers that meant nothing to a Wisconsin January unless I made them mean something. I moved a cot into the barn on the second night. I told myself it was practical, that I couldn't keep the stove fed from the house. But the truth was, I didn't trust the thermometer to hold steady if I wasn't there to watch it disbelieve me. I fed the wood stove every 40 minutes through the first night, checked the hygrometer by headlamp, misted the bags with well water that had gone nearly as cold as the air itself, and somewhere around 4 in the morning, I stopped being able to tell if my hands were shaking from the cold or from being awake for 20 hours straight. The second night went the same as the first except worse, because by then, my body understood what was being asked of it and had started to refuse in small ways. A held breath before standing, a slowness climbing back down from the loft where I kept the dry split wood. I burned through the seasoned oak faster than I'd budgeted, and had to go out to the woodpile behind the house in the dark, in that cold, moving slow and deliberate, because I'd read somewhere, or maybe my grandfather had written it, that quick movement in real cold was how people hurt themselves without noticing. By the third morning, I was talking to the stove. Not words exactly, just sound, low and constant, the way you'd talk to an animal that didn't understand you but understood tone. That was the morning the dairyman's truck came up the drive before 7, headlights still on in the gray dark, and he was out of the cab and into the barn before I'd finished latching the door behind him, like he'd been listening for 3 days, and finally couldn't stand it anymore. He didn't ask if I was all right. He looked at me, really looked, the kind of look that takes an inventory, and then he looked at the stove, at the log I'd apparently loaded in wrong, sideways, so it wasn't catching, and he fixed it without a word. "How long since you slept?" I told him I'd slept some. He said that wasn't an answer. He made me sit on a hay bale in the corner while he checked the hygrometer himself, tapped it twice like it might be lying, and pulled his own coat off and hung it over the gap where the cot had let a draft slide through all night without my noticing. "Your grandfather did this once," he said. "Winter of '74. Nearly froze half his spawn out trying to save the rest. I told him then what I'll tell you now. The stove doesn't need you awake. It needs wood, and it needs somebody to check it who isn't half gone from exhaustion, because that's when a person gets careless with a flame." He stayed through the 4th morning. I slept 4 hours on the cot while he sat with a thermos of coffee and the hygrometer, and didn't wake me once. And when I came up out of it, disoriented, and reaching for the logbook before I'd even opened both eyes, he was already writing the numbers down himself, in handwriting that looked, in the low lamplight, almost exactly like the handwriting in the notebook in the workshop. On the morning of the 44th day I woke before the alarm, before the old dairyman had even finished his coffee, because something in the barn smelled different. Not bad different. Not the sour rot smell that had haunted the first 2 weeks, when half the bags had turned to green mold and I'd hauled them out into the snow and stood there in the dark wondering if I'd wasted the whole cold season on a dead man's hobby. This was a smell like rain on warm dirt, though it was 19 degrees outside and the ground had been frozen since Thanksgiving. I climbed down off the cot and walked the row with the flashlight before I let myself believe it, because I had believed things before and been wrong. The bags along the east wall, the ones we'd inoculated on the 60th day, the ones I'd stopped checking twice a day because they'd shown nothing but white thread for 3 straight weeks, had broken open overnight. Little gray-white knuckles pushing up out of the slits in the plastic, dozens of them, clustered like they were reaching for the one bare bulb hanging from the rafter. I put my hand flat against the nearest cluster, and it was cool and slightly damp and alive in a way that made my throat go tight before I'd even decided to feel anything. I did not have time to feel anything. The note was due at the bank by end of business, and it was 7 in the morning. The banker's truck came up the drive at 9, same as he'd said he would when he called Tuesday to remind me, in a voice that already had the paperwork half filled out. He got out in his good coat, the one he wore for foreclosure meetings and church, and he had a folder under his arm and an expression that wasn't unkind so much as finished, a man who had already decided how this conversation would go and was just waiting for me to catch up to him. I didn't invite him into the house. I walked him straight to the barn instead, and I watched his face when the cold hit him, and I watched it again when I lifted the flap of the nearest bag and he saw what was growing there, in rows under the bulb light, gilled and gray and smelling like the woods after rain. "I don't want your check today," I said, and I set the crate down on the workbench between us. 24 oyster mushrooms I'd cut that morning with a paring knife, still cool from the barn, laid out on a clean feed sack, because I didn't own anything nicer to present them in. "I want you to taste what 44 days bought." He didn't taste them. He picked one up instead, turned it over, looked at the gills, the way a man looks at a thing he doesn't have a category for. I put the notebook next to the crate, not my grandfather's, mine, the one I'd started in December, with the Sawmill's disposal log stapled to the inside cover and the signed order sheet from the distributor 2 counties over, 40 pounds a week starting the following Monday, and Petrick Brothers' own letterhead confirming free sawdust delivery through October. He read the order sheet twice. He looked at the crate again. "This isn't a payment," he said. "No," I said. "It's proof I can make one, every week, going forward, instead of once and never again." He was quiet long enough that I heard the stove ticking behind us and the wind working at the loose board on the north wall, and somewhere under all of it my own heartbeat, which I noticed I could hear because I had, at some point in the last 5 minutes, stopped holding my breath. Kessler signed the extension on a Thursday, the 24th of February, 2022, in the same office with the same photograph of the man shaking hands with a man in a suit, and he did not shake my hand when I left, but he walked me to the door, which he had not done in December. The note carried 90 more days at the same rate, secured now against the supply contract instead of the land, and he told me, not unkindly, that he'd be checking the delivery logs. I told him he was welcome to. The 40 pounds a week became 60 by April. Whitcomb's took what the distributor didn't, paying cash on Fridays, and I kept the receipts in a coffee can on the workshop shelf until the can filled and I bought a proper ledger, green cloth cover, nothing like my grandfather's, because I didn't want it to look like his. I wanted it to look like mine. By the second week of August, I drove to the bank with a cashier's check for $4,600, the balance of what remained after the spring payments, and Kessler counted it twice at his desk, the way he'd turned the mushroom over in his hand back in January, like he still didn't have a category for it. He stamped the note "paid in full" and slid the paper across without much ceremony, and I remember thinking that was exactly right. No ceremony, just a stamp, just a Thursday. The dairyman started coming by most mornings that spring without being asked, the way he had all winter, except now there was less to worry about and more to look at. He'd stand at the door of the second barn, the one we cleared out in March, hauling 40 years of rusted stanchions to the scrapyard in Petrick's own flatbed, which he lent me for the cost of diesel, and he'd watch the mist settle on the racks, the way another man might watch weather come in over a field he'd planted. He never said much about what it meant to him. Once, in April, restacking sawdust blocks, he said only that this was closer to what your grandfather pictured than what your grandfather built, and then he asked where I wanted the next row. We opened a third barn by the following March, The old machine shed nobody had used since the tractor was traded in 1988, insulated it with what scrap lumber Petrick Brothers couldn't sell, and by then, I wasn't hauling sawdust in the truck bed alone anymore. I'd hired a boy from 2 farms over, 17, quiet, who didn't ask questions and worked like he understood there was something to prove. The ledger by that spring showed weekly orders from Whitcomb's, from the distributor, from a co-op grocery in the next county that had heard about us from a driver who delivered eggs on Tuesdays. When I added the year up in July, the whole 12 months since the first flush broke through in the cold, it came to just under $80,000, after feed, after fuel, after the boys' wages, after everything Petrick Brothers hadn't given us for free. I didn't tell anyone that number except the dairyman, standing in the doorway of the first barn on a July evening, with the light doing what it does at that hour in Wisconsin, gold and slow, and he didn't say anything about it either, just nodded once, the way he'd nodded at the ledger in January, and looked past me at the racks like he was looking for someone else who should have been standing there to see it. March came back around the way it does in Larson County, sideways, half mud and half frost, and on the second Tuesday of the month, I was standing in the same gravel lot at Petrick Brothers, with the truck bed down and the loader groaning through its hydraulics, dumping sawdust I still didn't pay a dime for. The man running the loader wasn't the one who'd waved me off that first December. He'd retired, moved to Florida, sent a postcard once through his nephew that just said, "Good for you, kid." This one knew my name, knew the order, didn't ask why a girl needed 40 cubic yards of pine dust 3 times a month, because by March of 2023, everybody in 3 counties knew why. 3 barns now. The dairy barn where it started, the old hay barn the dairyman helped me clear out in November, and a pole building I'd put up myself with a loan I didn't need but took anyway, because Roy Kessler had learned to stop underestimating what a signed supply contract was worth. He still processes my paperwork, still calls me ma'am, though there's less irony in it now than there used to be. I drove back that afternoon with the truck bed full and the heater not quite working right, and I thought, the way I do every time I pass the turn onto the county road, about the cellar. It's still there, still padlocked from the inside now instead of the outside, though there's nothing left in it worth locking away. The jars are cataloged, the spawn cultures are in a proper fridge in the workshop. The letter is framed on the wall where the light doesn't hit it directly, because paper that old doesn't need sun on top of everything else it survived. To whoever isn't afraid of rot, I read it maybe once a month still, not because I've forgotten what it says, but because some sentences are worth keeping in your mouth the way you keep a stone in your pocket, just to feel the weight of it against your leg while you walk. I think about him more now than I did that first winter, when there wasn't time to think about anything except degrees and days and money owed. I think about a man 46 years younger than I am now, standing in that same barn, with the same kind of dust on his hands, believing in something nobody around him could see the shape of yet, and then closing the door on it and never opening it again. I don't know why he stopped. I've stopped asking. Some things you inherit are instructions, and some things you inherit are just the unfinished part, left for somebody with more stubbornness or less to lose. If you're watching this from wherever you are, and there's a building on your family's land you've never been let into, a locked shed, a cellar nobody talks about, a drawer somebody always changes the subject away from, I'd tell you to go look. Not because there's $80,000 in it, most of the time there isn't, but there's usually something, a ledger, a letter, a name written down by somebody who thought nobody would ever read it again. 90 days felt like nothing when the bank gave them to me. It felt like everything by day 44. Now it's just the length of one winter, already folded into the ones before it and the ones still coming. If this is the kind of story you go looking for, stay a while. Tell me what's locked in your barn.